Hello, my name is Eric Simpson. I'm here with my good friend Ben Feiner. He's here to talk about comic books, specifically Marvel and DC and their rivalry. Hello, Ben. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for asking.
So, for anyone who's really out of the loop, who are Marvel and DC?
So, Marvel and DC are two of the largest comic book manufacturers in America. They have most of the popular characters like Superman, Batman, the X-Men, the Avengers. Those are all Marvel or DC. Actually, DC and Marvel, respectively. So,
Okay, so they're essentially the two largest distributors and publishers. Okay. And why are they different? Like, why does it matter? Why do people care about that?
so for a long time, Marvel and DC comics were just comic books. People who weren't fans of the comics didn't really know the difference. But recently, with the increasing popularity of the Marvel movies and DC having a lot of television shows and things, the comics have really been brought into the mainstream popular culture, and so the differences have been highlighted by just the everyday person as opposed to your stereotypical comic book nerd.
All right, interesting. Yeah. Um, how would you say has this changed a lot in the last few years, especially with the recent flood of superhero movies?
I'd say, at least as I've noticed, it has changed a lot. Growing up, it didn't matter if it was DC or Marvel Comics. If you liked superheroes, you liked them both. But nowadays, I find there's a lot of animosity between the fans of the two companies, and less in the tight comic book communities, but more in the general public. People will prefer one over the other in sort of a almost angry way.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that as well. It's especially on the internet. It seems to get pretty heated. Um, exactly how are Marvel and DC different? Like, other than just being the two big ones, but what actually makes them unique versus relative? What actually makes them unique relative to each other?
Well, this has been something I've been thinking about a lot for the past few years, even. And the conclusion I've come to is that deep down, Marvel is a lot like science fiction. They take their crazy characters and their powers and explain them with pseudoscience, but science nonetheless. Whether it be alternate dimensions or mutations, even magic in the Marvel universe is explained with dimensional nonsense, for lack of a better term. But DC Comics does less of the explanation. There, where Marvel is science fiction, DC is at its core very fantasy-like. It's full of wonder. DC is not concerned with telling you exactly how a yellow sun gives a Kryptonian powers. It's just that's why he has powers.
He being Superman.
Yes, sorry. That's why Superman has powers, because he's under a yellow sun. And that radiation gives the Kryptonian powers. Where if that was in Marvel, you'd get all kinds of the science behind it, the fake science, but science nonetheless. Marvel explains their things, is all about having people understand, where DC is content with letting the wonder be wonderful, which, neither of those are bad routes. It's just a different kind of route that different people will like.
Interesting. Would you say Batman is an exception to the DC? Would you say Batman is an exception to how DC is all about wonder, especially because he doesn't have superpowers?
I think there are exceptions to both of the rules, where DC has people like Batman who have no powers, and Marvel has characters like Doctor Strange, whose entire repertoire of powers is magic, which doesn't really fit in the sci-fi. But at the same time, Batman's gadgets aren't really scientifically sound, Batarang being number one of not how that would work. And Doctor Strange's magic abilities are typically written off based on dimensional holes and things like that. So even when there are exceptions, the exceptions still sort of fit in the stereotypes.
All right. I'm going to ask you to give the brief history now, but I would say, other than the impacts and how they've sort of set the groundwork for what we have today, don't spend too much time on something like anything like pre 1990, especially because that's, with the exception of the Superman and Batman movies, there were like almost no movies compared to what we have had since like. Yeah, since 1999, we've had a crazy number of super movies, especially since 2008.
Like the starts of the companies, and then after that, jump to now.
Right. And the reason I keep bringing up the movies so much is not just because that's where I'm coming from, but it's where the most non-comic book nerds are coming from too. So giving that a context with the movies involved will be better for the interview being more understandable to a non-nerd.
Absolutely.
Okay, so. Okay, interesting. Could you maybe give us a brief history of Marvel and DC and just comic books in general?
Absolutely. DC Comics is almost, if not over, 80.
Hold on. Although we're doing this like an interview, you don't have to be like, absolutely. Oh, let me go. You can be more casual, but you don't have. Okay. If you wanted to start off with absolutely and then go into, you totally can. I just was wondering if that felt natural or not for you. Or okay, sorry, you do what you want. Okay, I'll start again. Okay, interesting, Ben. That's interesting. Do you think you could give us a brief history of Marvel and DC and comic books in general?
Sure. DC Comics at this point is almost 80 years old, if not over 80 years old. And they started with a lot of the big heroes there. When a lot of people think about classic heroes, they think about DC heroes like Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman. The Justice League is much older. While the company that became Marvel Comics only started a few years after DC, Marvel, as we know it today with the Avengers and X-Men, Fantastic Four, didn't really start until...
And Spider-Man.
And Spider-Man, didn't really start until the 60s with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby when they started writing. And so the DC has sort of had a lot more history than Marvel, which is part of the reason I think why they're so different nowadays. And speaking of nowadays the companies have taken very different routes with their just designs of characters. If you look at DC's movies, they've tried to be very dark and gritty, serious, which sometimes works for characters like Batman in the Nolan trilogy. It worked because it's very political, where Marvel nowadays and throughout their history has gone with, it's very pulp. It's cartoony because they're effectively cartoons on a page, and that's come through with their movies nowadays.
Cool, interesting. When did the whole movie craze really start for Marvel and DC?
Well, DC has been making movies for a while. There's some good, some bad, but DC's been doing sort of live action representations for a long time. Marvel, their first movie was not until the 80s, and it was actually a movie version of Howard the Duck, an obscure Marvel character, and it was not a very good movie. But much more recently, after the turn of the millennia, they started making movies that they ended up becoming a connected universe. Whether or not that was the original plan, I don't know. I know the Hulk movie from the early 2000s was not originally planned to be part of any connected universe, but after they started with their Marvel Cinematic Universe they have now, they officially christened that Hulk movie as the canon one for the universe. And so Marvel's movies have started very recently as opposed to DC's, but they're working I think more successfully because they don't have those past, I mean, for lack of a better term, atrocities that they have to overcome. Marvel started big and they're staying big with their theater.
So I probably won't put this in, but you're saying that the 2003 Ang Lee Hulk movie is the one that's part of MCU and not the Edward Norton one?
Whichever one is the more recent one.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the Edward Norton one, the one from 2008, because
Okay,
Robert Downey Jr. did have a cameo in that one. I think, if not Samuel L. Jackson, I think definitely Robert Downey Jr. was it. They even had Robert Downey Jr. in the trailer for Edward Norton's Hulk, which was like all but confirming that Avengers were going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess no, the trailer for Iron Man had Nick Fury in it too. Anyway, okay, all right, that's okay, great. That's a lot of interesting background. But why do comics matter to you?
Growing up, I watched a lot of Cartoon Network, and they had shows specifically like Teen Titans. Really resonated with me, showing younger heroes. And that kind of thing made me want to know where these heroes came from. What is this show about? Because it obviously wasn't its own brand new concept. As I knew about Robin because my mother watched the Batman TV show in the 60s with Adam West. And so I knew about a lot of superheroes just as I was young. And as I got older, I started wanting to read the comics myself. And at one point, I got very sick and was in the hospital for a long time. And a friend of mine got me a 40-pack of random comics from this store called Newberry Comics near my hometown. And I just sat in the hospital and reading completely disconnected comics. There were ones from like the 80s and ones from the 2000s, things in different universes. They were all over the place. And I was just, I loved the way that characters, that they were such short stories, but they had beginnings and resolutions at the same time as leaving things open for a bigger story. And I loved that idea. And so comics have always been to me just a place to go, something that I love to look into such deep lore. And it was just something I could sink into.
That's a really, I'm going to sound so corny. What if I say, oh, that's so deep. That's so meaningful. No, that's really awesome that your friend did that for you. I'm sure that was a huge, really influential time in your life. How would you say the movies have affected the comics, especially since the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy and the Avengers universe, the MCU?
Well, Batman has had times of light and goofy like the Adam West 60s Batman show, and times of dark and gritty like Christopher Nolan's political trilogy. But at the same time, with Nolan's trilogy now, Batman, who was going towards more the cartoony, pulpy kind of thing, has moved back towards the dark and gritty because of the success of Nolan's movies. Marvel, however, has taken the movies are working really well to a startling level, to the point where they've restructured their entire comic book universe to make it more similar to the comics, or to the movies. They have taken characters who are different in the comics and changed them so they were a lot like they are in the movies. For example, in the main Marvel universe, in the comic books, Nick Fury is an old white guy. It wasn't until 2006, I believe, with the creation of the Ultimate Universe in the comics, where Nick Fury was based on the appearance of Samuel L. Jackson. But recently, they have modified the mainstream universe so he also looks like Samuel L. Jackson because of the popularity of the comics. The movies. They've also done other things like ending the Fantastic Four's comic book line, or changing the X-Men's importance in the history of the Marvel Universe to align comic books closer to the movies, which, while it alienates 40 and 50 years of comic book fans, it also makes the comics much easier for the new fans, the ones who are brought into it because of the movies. It makes it easier for them to pick things up. And if they are so inclined, they can look back into the history and see where things changed. but Marvel has massively changed their comics due to the movies, so they've had a huge influence.
That's crazy. That's crazy. If I didn't know how often they rewrite things, especially Superman, when by they I mean both Marvel and DC. If I didn't know how often they rewrite and restructure things, that would seem really awful and weird. But I guess it's happened more often recently, but it's not entirely unusual or unheard of. No. The weirdest thing though is I think crap. I had a thing. How the movies? Okay. Shoot, I had a fun fact. Dang it. Anyway. Okay. All right. Now. Okay. Awesome. More personal question. Which character and which movie is your favorite, and from both Marvel and DC?
DC Comics, Green Lantern has always been my number one. I just loved the idea of his power being based on his willpower. If he could imagine it, if he could will it into being, it became. And so theoretically, he could do anything. And that being said, the Green Lantern movie was not the best, but I enjoyed it a lot. And so I don't think DC's animated films has probably been better for me. They made a series of straight-to-DVD animated films recently that have been very good. And so probably one of those would be considered my favorite. One called Throne of Atlantis was a Justice League movie about Aquaman. Marvel, on the other hand, my favorite character in Marvel Comics is one of the X-Men named Nightcrawler. He's this German man, has blue skin and a devil tail. He can teleport around and carries double katanas. And that, it's just awesome to me. I don't have as much of a heartfelt reason as I do for Green Lantern. I just think Nightcrawler is super cool. And that being said, my favorite Marvel movie also does not include my favorite Marvel character, because Nightcrawler is not in any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, of which I have fallen in love with. I think probably my favorite Marvel movie has to be either Ant-Man or Guardians of the Galaxy. As great as the Avengers are, they're a bit cliche to me, where I feel like Ant-Man was able to... all the Avengers are all the super cool heroes, where Ant-Man's kind of goofy. Like, his power is to shrink. Granted, in the comics he can also grow, but his power is to shrink. It's just weird. But it's so cool that they can take a weird power and make that awesome like they did in that film. And so I think probably even more than Guardians, which is also weird, but it's a team of aliens, Ant-Man is just there, and I think I really like that about him. So Ant-Man's probably my favorite Marvel movie.
What's your favorite DC movie?
Like I said, the animated Throne of Atlantis movie, one of their straight-to-DVD animated movies.
Okay, but if you had to pick a live-action one, which one would you pick?
See, I have to say The Dark Knight, which is a shame because I hate that. I hate the Nolan trilogy. As much as, Dark Knight Returns aside, Batman Begins...
Rises.
Thank you. Dark Knight Rises. Dark Knight Returns is something else. There's actually a comic line that they're loosely based on. But Dark Knight Rises aside, Batman Begins and Dark Knight were fantastic movies. I just don't like dark, gritty Batman. I love Adam West, goofy, cartoony, bright blue suit Batman. And so I don't like the Nolan trilogy because they made it incredibly political. That being said, it was done phenomenally. Heath Ledger played an amazing Joker. The actor who played Harvey Dent,
Aaron Eckhart.
Thank you. Did a great job. Everyone in those movies is really good. I just have a personal vendetta against those movies for making dark and gritty Batman the only acceptable Batman.
Yeah, actually, I could agree on that point. from the trailers up until the most recent one for Batman versus Superman, I was really concerned that it wasn't going to be any fun. It was just going to be dark and gritty, and while at the same time corny, but in a bad way. You know, especially seeing. I mean, we had a discussion in a previous recording about. Although you had more of an issue with Jesse Eisenberg than I did, but I could totally see where you were coming from. Anyway, could you maybe touch on what graphic novels are briefly?
So, graphic novels are sort of, in reality, they're just a different term for comic books, one more accepted. But when people think about a graphic novel, they think of sort of a longer form comic. And in the comic book world of DC Comics and Marvel Comics, if you ever get a graphic novel, it's usually a compilation of all the comics that make up a specific plot line. Like you can find graphic novels of the Batman plotline Killing Joke, which took 5 or 6 comics to make up, but the graphic novel version is then put together and oftentimes remastered, touched up with different color scheme, things like that. And so graphic novels are typically long-form versions of comic books.
Are they sometimes used to have self-contained stories too, or even be like third-party publishings, third-party published material, sort of like I know there are plenty of graphic novel series, but stuff like Neil Gaiman's Sandman. Is that no, or is it American Gods? One of those. I don't know. When I had this impression that American graphic novels were like the more sophisticated version of comic books. I put sophisticated in air quotes, but you can't see it. Stuff like Watchmen or stuff by Neil Gaiman, things like that. I know more recently I've heard of things that I wasn't aware of whether they were Marvel, DC, or something else, but they seemed like they weren't about superheroes necessarily. So they seemed in a different category. Scott Pilgrim was another, although I know that was a series as well. I loved the movie, so that's how I got interested in that. Okay, now for the last question, the one you were excited about. What do you think is special about comic books? What do you think is so special about comic books versus other forms of media for entertainment?
This is actually something that if you asked me 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer it the way I can now. But in my last semester here at school, I took a class called Aesthetics Expression Street Art. And in that class, we read a book called Unflattening. And the book, it's a graphic novel, but it's actually someone's thesis paper. He's the only person to have ever submitted a master's thesis in graphic novel form. And when asked why he did it, he said because the combination of words and images in the style of a comic book captures something that nothing else can. Because when you look at a comic book, you're flowing right with the story. Even if you're just seeing stills and words on a page, you see where it's coming from and how it's coming, and you are practically watching a movie right there, frame by frame. The words and the images come together to make something you couldn't have with just one or the other. And I think that's what makes comic books what they are, their ability to tell fantastical stories full of wonder so much better than something like a novel. If Superman was originally came out as a novel, it would have had a very different impact, because when you look at Superman, when you think of Superman, as much as you may think of, truth, justice, and the American way, the things he stands for, you picture that symbolic S right on his chest. And you think of Batman, you don't just think of him shouting at the Joker, where are the hostages, all that stuff. You see the cape and the cowl and the batarangs. But if you were just seeing pictures, it still wouldn't be that. It's the combination of the words, seeing the way these people feel and the way they speak and the way they act in words and pictures captures something that nothing else can. And I think that's an amazing thing.
Wow, that's an awesome answer. I love that. That's if anything, you're going to make me start reading comics. So once again, I'm Eric Simpson. Ben, thank you so much for doing this for me. This was a pleasure.
No problem. I had fun.
This is Eric Simpson signing off.